Go ahead, Andy.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I am excited for this webinar, and I just wanted to say a sentence or two before I turn over to Dr. Lee Holcombe. When Dr. Holcombe approached me with some of this research he's been doing and some of this analysis, and I immediately thought it was a great idea for a webinar to share with our members and staff at our member agencies, because it's getting at an issue that I've always felt needed to be addressed and to date hasn't been. Thinking back on my days, working and determining how much to allocate in state support to various institutions and governing boards, you always started out with what the base number was, and we never really had that discussion of how much should we be providing, how much should it cost to deliver higher education in the state. And with that in mind, I just felt like this is a very timely topic, and I was excited when Dr. Holcombe shared these ideas with me, and I'm excited to share them with you. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Holcombe for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Andy, and I also want to thank Chris as well for providing the opportunity to connect the webinar through SHEEO. Obviously, you're connected with the right people who need to see issues related to the question at hand. I also want to thank everyone who is taking time out of their busy schedule to tune in. I hope this is going to be useful for you. I've noticed on the participant list that we have a good mix of state level and institutional level folks. One of the things that I think, this model, what I'm going to present is a statewide analysis, but keep in mind that this model can be drilled down and applied at the institutional level as well. So hopefully those of you at the institutional level will find this helpful for those reasons. Regarding questions, what I'm going to be doing is going through the presentation and switching over to an Excel format. While you have the opportunity, as Chris explained, to submit questions, I encourage you to do so as we go through the presentation. Unfortunately, I can't see those questions as we go. So my presentation is timed to about 35 minutes, which gives us plenty of time thereafter to address any questions. If, in fact, you have any questions that might arise after the webinar, up on your screen. So let's go ahead and get into what we're going to go through here. The outline. I first want to talk about motivation, and because what higher education should cost is a pretty provocative question, and we've probably got about 40 or plus people listening in, and if we asked you that question, we'd probably get 40 different kinds of answers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation, where this came about, and because it tells you what this actually does, and just as importantly, what it does not. So, and then after I talk about that, I'm going to actually describe the model in detail, and then I think I'm going to actually apply it to Texas General formula funding for Texas General Academic Institutions for the fiscal year 16-17 legislative biennium. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have time for questions afterwards. So let's talk a little bit about motivation. The chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, the prior chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, was in his position for quite some time, and had been a perennial poser of the question, how much should higher education cost? And he and other like-minded legislators had grown increasingly frustrated by the lack of a real substantive response to that question. Most of the time, the responses that they received were basically reverted to cost plus models. What that suggests is there's an identified need for a response or a model that is not too complex, and that's an important one. So for example, in Texas, they have the existing formula funding model that is a basis for recommendations for appropriations. and it's very detailed. It gets that cost per semester credit hour at various levels, various stages through the higher ed pipeline for different majors, etc. It gets so complex that unless you're actually immersed in the model on a day in and day out basis, it's really difficult for that complexity to penetrate the higher level policy making discussions, especially when things get to the legislature. So in effect renders it ineffectual. The second characteristic is you want something that facilitates discussions of appropriations in terms of strategic higher education goals of the state, and complements other state finance policies. And what often happens is that you have your approach is the first bullet is, I think there's a natural tension between the first bullet and the second two. So what happens often is, I think discussions err too far on something that's too simple and therefore ineffectual, or not really meaningful, versus something that's too complex and essentially ineffectual. So what I've come up with is a model that determines what higher education should cost based upon statewide measures of efficiency and productivity, right? And they satisfy four very important criteria. They're readily understandable, tracked over time, and related to institutional practices, and they also resonate with state higher education goals. As I was developing this model, or actually just prior to, I started working also with state stakeholders on developing the framework for the post-closing the gaps plan. And one of the first things that we did was take a look back at how is it that closing the gaps has been such a success, and success as measured by it has basically framed the vocabulary of higher ed policy in the state for the last 15 years. Well, one of the reasons why that is because it has it's simple. It has just four goals, and it has measures that are attached to each of those goals that satisfy these criteria. So I thought that the model that we come up with for asking the question how much higher education should cost should also satisfy those criteria. So what this clearly suggests is what the model is not. This is not a representation or an attempt to estimate what the cost of learning should be, right? And I think that connotes there's a lot to higher ed, right? And so how much does it cost to not just teach students material in the class, but also mature them as adults, as future participants in our civic society, etc. So one of the things that we're not able to do is understand what the cost of learning actually is. I don't think anybody's been able to do that, especially on a statewide level, perhaps on an institutional level, or a department level. But that's something that is clearly beyond the scope of this presentation, and I think the scope of which is more directly aligned to the current needs of state policy. So before we get into the actual description of the model, I want to recapitulate. There are two phases of state higher education finance. This is obvious. This is obvious, I'm sure, to everybody on this phone call. But phase one is legislative appropriation, or basically the size of the pie. And phase two is the distribution of appropriation, which has obviously traditionally been based upon enrollment and is increasingly based upon performance through the performance-based funding 2.0 that's spreading through the nation. Phase two has attracted a lot of attention, and I think it has almost drowned out things that are happening at the phase one level. There's lots of things happening in phase two. But one of the things I would note is that the performance metrics that you have in most performance-based funding systems again, satisfy those characteristics that I mentioned before. They reflect state higher education goals, they're easily understood, and they relate directly to institutional operations. Now, there's a lot of controversy whether or not it's a good thing or bad thing, whether or not it's leading to its intended outcomes. In fact, I think I just saw yesterday a new report about the effects in Washington that's being disputed by many. So, I don't want to say that I'm agreeing with performance-based funding or not agreeing with it, but what I will say is that one of the things that performance-based funding has done is it's led to conversations among institutions and between institutions and state officials about efficiency and productivity that I don't think in many states were there previously. So in that respect, I think performance-based funding has done something new. So in many respects, what I'm trying to do with this phase one model, which is clearly, I'm not sure I made that clear, what I'm going to be talking about is phase one. But what I'm trying to do in this phase one model is to provide an opportunity to talk about how much higher education should cost in terms of efficiency and productivity, much like performance-based funding has done for phase two. So let's get to the model. All right. So my general approach, what I'm going to be doing is talking about legislative appropriation. But what I first do is talk about how much higher education should cost in total. And I reference educational costs only. So basically what I do is I take the total costs and I subtract out public service, research, and auxiliary. You can take a look at alternative specifications of educational costs. Like the Delta Cost Project has a little bit different approach. But so you can use different metrics for educational costs. In Texas, there's an appropriation by sector, 4-year or general academic institutions, and then 2-year institutions. I have applied this model to both. For today's purposes, I'm going to be restricting my attention to just 4-year, but the model applies to both equally easily. And again, these are based upon projections for efficiency and productivity. So the question is answered, how much should higher education cost, assuming those projections of efficiency and productivity. And then after that portion of the analysis, I step into questions about how much that total cost should be borne by the state. So my contention is that it's very difficult to have a meaningful relationship about state appropriation unless you've done the first bullet. And I think and often it is the case that in fact people go directly to the second bullet without paying due attention to the first bullet. For the second bullet, as I'll explain later, I do utilize IPED's finance data to address the question about state share. There are multiple approaches that could be used. I used IPED's data to look at the finance data for the national peer institutions. In Texas, the 4-year institutions have self-identified peers across the country. And so what I've done is utilize IPEDS to access the finance data of those institutions to compare how the revenue mix of those institutions versus the institutions in the state of Texas. The basic arithmetic behind the model is very straightforward. There's nothing new here. Total educational cost for a given year is educational cost per full-time student times the number of full-time students. Now, for the purposes of my model, I specify my efficiency measure as educational cost per full-time student. And again, that's nothing new, and it's widely used not just in this country, but across among the OECD countries as well. Now, what is a little bit different is I relate the number of FTSEs, the number of full-time students, to as a function of productivity. And this is what was new at the agency when I was developing it. and may be new to you as well. So to see how that the number of FTSEs is related to productivity, I developed this little flow chart that looks at the number of full-time students in year Y-1, going from left to right, and leading into ultimately resulting in the number of full-time students in year Y. So what you do is you take number of full-time students in year Y-1 and you add in the number of new full-time students that were not there in year Y-1. And in the model that I developed, I basically make that as a function of demographic projections of the state. That's done by the agency on an annual basis, and it's actually a very robust methodology itself. But where these productivity metrics come in that were not there before is in the students who leave. And so I define a leaver as a student who drops out of the system without a credential, a 4-year credential. And I relate that in terms of the leaver rate. And then similarly, I define the number of a completer as a student who gains a 4-year credential and does not return the following year. And so you can express completers with a credential as a function of the completer rate. So these two metrics, that is the leaver rate and the completer rate, is what's new here. And it turns out they allow you to do some things that weren't readily available before. But before we get into the demonstration, which I'll illustrate through the demonstration, before we get to that, I want to sort of summarize the efficiency and productivity measures that are the basis for this model. So the efficiency measure, as I mentioned, is educational cost per full-time student. And as this measure improves, in terms of looking at things from an efficiency framework, the cost per student decreases. And as the cost per student decreases, your total estimated educational costs should decrease. Okay. Now, the productivity measure of leaver rate. So let me sort of back up here as well. So I refer to, for the purposes of this model, I talk about productivity in terms of how well students are going through the pipeline. And efficiency is cost per student, but productivity for the purposes of the model is restricted to how well students go through the pipeline. So the productivity measure of leaver rate is, of course, leaver is defined as the number of students who leave without a credential divided by the total number of students in year Y-1. As this measure improves, you have fewer students leaving, your leaver rate decreases, and you have more students in the system. So as you improve productivity as measured by leaver rate, you actually increase what total educational costs should be. This is an important point because I was very involved in the discussions of efficiency and productivity in Texas in the last few years, and the stakeholders just seem to assume that when you increase efficiency and productivity, that means you decrease costs. Okay, and so one of the nice things about this rate is, and as I'll demonstrate and illustrate it with the demonstration, is that it shows you very clearly that everything else being equal, if institutions are doing a better job at retaining students and keeping students in their classrooms, then obviously costs are going to increase. The last productivity measure is completer rate. Again, this is the number of students who leave with a 4-year credential divided by the total number of students in year Y-1. Again, for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm restricting my attention to 4-year institutions. In my model that looks at 2-year institutions, I include transfers to 4-year. And so, in contrast to leaver rate, as this measure improves, you're going to have more students leaving the system, right? Statewide. Again, I'm looking at statewide, looking at a statewide perspective. So if you have a student, for example, at Texas State University in San Marcos, and they get a degree and then enroll at graduate school at UT, they would not be included as in the completer rate, because they're counted in the following year, year Y. So as this measure improves, you get more students who are leaving the system with a credential. You get total educational cost should decrease. So before we go on to the actual demonstration and illustration of the model, I want to sort of revisit these key characteristics, because I think now that you've actually seen the efficiency and productivity measures, I think you can make more sense of why they are important. These measures that I'm talking about are aligned with most Stage 2 performance-based funding systems that I've seen. They're pretty common to have extra points for institutions that get increase the number of students getting to 30 or 60 or 90 semester credit hours, and graduating, etc. They're aligned with state higher education goals, obviously. So I think what a model for phase 1 that we're talking about would lead to a greater policy coherence. If the kinds of things, the kinds of vocabulary, and the kinds of things that you're looking at to determine total higher education costs and state appropriation are using the same vocabulary that you use when you're looking at performance-based distribution during Stage 2, and of course your state higher education goals. These measures are transparent. They're readily digestible. I think you could read about these in a newspaper article and understand what that means. And so legislators can easily grasp what those mean. They're measurable over time. As long as you have in your state the ability to track students over time. So you would have to, there may be in some states some limitations in that regard. You have to have a common identifier for students that you can trace through databases over time. And they're easily computed. As I mentioned, leaver rate and completer rate were the agency was not already computing those measures, but it took a matter of hours to actually compute them the first time, and a matter of minutes to update them for subsequent cohorts. So this is not a labor-intensive proposition at all. And as I mentioned and hinted at the very beginning, you can do this for specific institutions. In fact, as I'll talk about later on, that's actually a very important aspect to this. And then, one of the things that states place a lot of value on is being able to compare themselves on measures to other states. Now, the efficiency measure, that is educational cost per full-time student, obviously is used in all states and can be computed for all states and OECD countries as well. Now, that's not true of leaver and completer rates because, in fact, they are new. So having said that, let's go in and actually look at the model and apply the model. As I mentioned earlier, what I'm going to be doing now is demonstrating or applying the model to Texas and projecting what higher education should cost in the 16-17 legislative biennium. I'm going to start off by first projecting what the total educational expenditures should be, and then I'll demonstrate what the appropriations should be as a function of those total expenditures. So as you see here, I've got my Excel spreadsheet up and going, and what we see is that we've got, for each year from 2006 through 2017, we've got the completer rate, leaver rate, and cost per full-time student. The values from 2006 through 2012 are in black, and these are actual values from Texas. The values in red are red because they're projections. And what we're going to be taking a look at first is completer rates. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make I'm going to project into the future under two different scenarios. The first scenario is what I'm calling my 2012 baseline scenario. It's probably an unrealistic scenario, but I'm doing it just so we have some basis for comparison to something. And what you see here is basically that and it's as related currently here in the spreadsheet, for each one of the values, the completer rate, leaver rate, and cost per student, I'm assuming that they're going to be the same throughout my projected time period into 2017. And so if we make those assumptions, then it turns out that what we're going to have for the biennial projection in 16-17, just over 1,017,000 full-time students statewide in Texas four-year public institutions. We're going to have, which corresponds to just over $16 billion. So in other words, one way to frame that is, the Texas public institutions, what should they cost for the 16-17 biennium, assuming the 2012 efficiency and productivity is just over $16 billion. Now, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be changing each one of these values individually to show you the effect that that change has. And so I'm going to be changing it, assuming some additional efficiencies and productivity. And what we'll be able to see is the change, the new projected full-time students, and the new corresponding total expenditures, and we'll of course have a row here that indicate the difference. So let's go ahead and get started looking at completer rate. Now, completer rate, if you recall, is completer is a student who was there in given year Y, Y minus 1, attained a credential in year Y minus 1 and did not return in year Y. And so a completer rate is the number of completers divided by total enrollment from year Y minus 1. And what we see in Texas is a fairly impressive increase from 2006 when it was 14.3% to 15.9% in 2012. And so let's take a look at what would happen to our 2006-17 projections if we come up with a different scenario moving forward from 2012. If you'll notice, since 2010, we've got a 0.4 percentage point increase through 2012. So what I'm going to do moving forward is assume a 0.3 percentage point increase, and I think it's fairly consistent with the past. So this is going to make this 16.2, 16.5, 16.8, 17.1, and 17.4. And what you saw as I changed those values moving forward is the projection pretty much follows what's been happening in the past, and it's a reasonable extrapolation into 2017 based upon what happened between 2006 and 2012. And so what you see in this table here is the effect of changing those values. And as expected, as we increase the completer rate, we have more students coming out of the system relative to the baseline projections. And in this case, what we have is about almost 18,000 fewer full-time students. And of course, if you have fewer full-time students, that would correspond to less money. And as you see here, we've got about a difference of $283 million less in total relative to the baseline projection. So now, as I mentioned, I basically came up with these numbers to project something that looks reasonable relative to what happened in the past. But in fact, what I would suggest is that there should be a process that incorporates numbers for individual institutions that could then be boiled up to coming up with these projections moving forward. So, so what do I mean by that? You could apply this model to individual institutions. So what I would suggest might be a good approach from a state perspective is to actually ask for input from each public institution in the state on what they project their completer rates to be moving forward. And the reason why that's important is because the individual institutions are the ones who know best what types of initiatives they have on campus that would affect completer rate, and be able to project those values moving forward as a function of those initiatives, and as a function to what's been happening in the past for that specific institution. So the state would be able to give each institution their completer rates in the past, and then the institution would be responsible for providing to the state what their projections are moving forward to 2017. And so I think, in other words, what this is, the model could be a catalyst for increasing collaboration between institutions and the state in developing projections for total expenditures moving forward. And another reason why this is important is because you have different types of institutions which are trying to do different types of things. So, you know, you've got, for example, here in Texas, you have emerging research institutions. Emerging research institutions are trying to become the next flagship institution. So these are institutions like University of Houston, UT Dallas, Texas Tech. There's about 8 of them. And so what you would imagine is that, you know, these institutions' attempts to become the next flagship institutions would play in part in the projections of how these numbers are going to change moving forward. And I think it's especially true for cost per full-time student, which, you know, we'll get to that projection moving forward. So I'll circle back to that point when we get there. So this is the projection of, based upon changes in completer rate. I'm going to go ahead and return this back to the baseline numbers, and then we'll repeat the process looking at lever rate. So let's go ahead and so what you see here in lever rate, and again, levers are students who leave the statewide 4-year institution system without a credential. And the lever rate is the number of levers divided by total enrollment. And what you see is that you've got an impressive decrease in Texas from 17.3% in 2006 to 15.3% in 2009. And then it climbs back up to 16.5% in 2012. And so, again, the baseline scenario is assuming this continues forward. Let's see what happens if we project decreases in the lever rate. Of course, remember here, decreases in lever rate is actually an improvement in productivity. So what we're going to do is just assume it decreases per year. So that would make this 16.3, 15.9, 15.7, excuse me, 15.5, 15.3. All right, so whether or not that is a, oh, I think I skipped one here, didn't I? This should be 16.1. You could see that apparent skip, and it's not a smooth curve. So let me propagate that through 2017. Okay. So then, if indeed you can decrease the leaver rate by 0.2 percentage points per year, you get 15.5% in 2017, a full percentage point difference between, than relative to 2012. And if you can achieve that additional productivity, you actually, as we talked about before, result in an increase in the number of full-time students because you have fewer students leaving the system. In fact, in this scenario, you have just over 12,000 fewer full-time students leaving the system, which of course corresponds to an increase in what higher education should cost for the biennium. And in this case, it's about $191 million, almost $200 million. So then now let's go ahead and go through and take a look at what happens when we adjust cost per full-time student. Take this back to baseline scenarios. Let's pull up the cost per full-time student graph here. These numbers are adjusted for inflation. And so to remind you, we've got educational cost per full-time student defined as total cost minus research, public service, and auxiliary divided by number of full-time students. And as you've seen here for Texas 40 institutions statewide, that cost has increased from 2006, where it was about 15.5, to reach the high of 16.921 actually in 2009, and decreased into about 15.8 in 2012. And what I've got here for the baseline is a roughly flat scenario projection. It's not exactly flat, but what I've assumed moving forward from 2012 is we have a rate of annual decrease in my efficiencies, or increase in my, rate of annual decrease in my cost per student of 1%, balanced out by an annual inflation adjustment of 1%. And that's what results in the flat projection moving forward. Now, if I go ahead and assume that the efficiency decreases at a faster rate, and let's say 1.5% per year, then what you see is that here's the graph. It achieves about $15,400 in 2017, and so let's take a look at what that means in terms of the projections. You'll note here that the number of full-time students has not changed, and that makes sense because we're not affecting the productivity in this particular scenario. All we're adjusting is the efficiency. The completer rate and the leaver rate has not changed at all. Okay, so if we do nothing to change the projected number of students yet increase the efficiency, then our what higher education should cost in total for the biennium in Texas public 40 institutions is $362 less, $362 million less, excuse me. So I want to circle back to the comment I made about how these projections could be made for individual institutions and then boiled up to a statewide level, and how this projection could vary by type of institution. I mentioned the emerging research institutions. Now, these are institutions, as I mentioned, that are trying to become the next flagship institution. So what they're doing is trying to attract a very different type of faculty member, and that costs money, right? So you would guess that these institutions would project, account for the increased costs of doing business as a flagship or trying to become a flagship in the projections for what their future cost per student will be. Now, at the same time, obviously, they're trying to become more efficient. So, these numbers moving forward for the emerging research institutions would account not just for their increasing costs of what it takes to be a flagship institution, or at least an aspiring flagship institution over time, but also in addition to the initiatives that they're got ongoing at their institutions to try to increase efficiency, whatever those may be. Now, so that would be a very different type projection for those emerging research institutions than, for example, UT and A&M, both. They're both at capacity. They're not going to be increasing the number of students remarkably. They have large contingents of PhD students already in emerging research institutions. One of the reasons why they're going to be becoming more expensive is they've got more robust graduate programs over time, and that of course costs more money. UT and A&M already have robust graduate programs, and so UT and A&M are going to be just looking at how they can, their projections of this, their cost per student moving forward are going to be more based upon the efficiencies and not a change in mission. So I think these are all very important points. But this conversation, this type of discussion is an illustration of how this model allows for you to draw a direct bridge between what's going on in institutions and what total cost should be. So now that we've had this discussion, so we've got, I'm going to go ahead and let's move forward and talk about what the state appropriation should be as a function of these costs. And so in preparation for that, I'm going to move these numbers back to their the additional efficiency projections. So this is 16.2, I believe, 16.5, 16.8, 17.1, and 17.4. This is 16.3, 16.1, 15.9, 15.7, 15.5. All right, so we've got this, under this scenario, we're assuming all the efficiencies moving forward, in which case we would have about 6,000 fewer full-time students and about $500 million less for the biennium, okay? So let's move down and see what how we can use this information to make projections on formula funding or the state share. And what I actually project here is formula funding. The reason why I did that is because that's the state appropriation in Texas that is intended to fund educational costs. So what you see here in vertical axis is the formula funding biennial appropriation in millions of dollars. And on the, as a function of, on the horizontal axis, state share from formula funding of total educational expenses. And I've got my range, I've got two boundaries set up. Where I've got 26.5% as a lower boundary. And it turns out that the percentage of total educational expenses covered by formula funding in 2012 in Texas was 26.5%. So that's why I have that there. Now, as I mentioned in the setup, another basis that you can use to account for what this state share should be is what's going on with self-appointed peers of Texas four-year institutions. And if you take a look at using IPED's data, it turns out that among the national peers of Texas four-year institutions, there's a higher percentage of their educational operations that's covered by state appropriation. So it's about 6%, about 6.2%, 32.7% to be precise. So I set that up as my sort of upward boundary in terms of what the state share should be. So what this gives you is a range driven by two different contexts that could drive the conversations about what state share should be. And you've got, of course, state share of what? Well, you've got two different scenarios that we've been talking about. The red line, of course, is assuming baseline 2012 baseline efficiencies in the 16-17 biennium. And the blue line is assuming all efficiencies are achieved, the clear rate, lever rate, and cost per student. And so what you see here then is the vertical boundary, right, to provide some context for the discussion on state share to move forward and to exist. So for example, if we assume that in the biennium, 16-17 biennium, Texas covers 26.5% of total educational expenditures, you're going to be on the low end, assuming all efficiencies are achieved, talking about just shy of $4.2 billion, about probably about $4.18 billion. Assuming 2012 efficiencies and productivity, you're going to be close to $4.3 billion. So it's about $100 million in difference in value. On the other end of the spectrum, assuming you've got Texas institutions being supported by the state at the rate that their peers are, you've got quite a bit more being appropriated in formula funding. Over $5 billion, and close to $5.1 billion, assuming all efficiencies are achieved. Over $5.2 billion, assuming 2012 efficiencies and productivity. So, and you can look at this, I guess, parallelogram, this area here, defined by what I'm outlining here with my cursor, as sort of the range of reasonable values for your discussion to move forward on state share. Another basis, and you could, I think what often happens is you just take a look at what has happened in the past in terms of state share. And in Texas, like in most other states, over time the state share has decreased. If you go back to 2009, actually 2010, it turns out that the state share of formula funding of total educational expenses was about a percentage point higher than it was in 2012. And so, that would put you, if you're gonna use that as a benchmark for where you should be in terms of state share, that's going to put you about right here. So your discussion regarding appropriation is going to be looking at somewhere between $4.1 billion to for about just shy of somewhere between 4.4 and 4.5 billion dollars. So that concludes my actual demonstration of the model. I'm going to revert back now to my PowerPoint. So I think what I hope to have illustrated is that the conversations about what higher education should cost and what the state obligations for the overall cost should be are what this model allows are in terms of efficiency and productivity. As opposed to projections of demographic trends, which of course have nothing to do with what's actually going on in institutions, the strategic goals of those institutions or the state. And then I think that they're so important. I went ahead and was explicit one more time about the characteristics of the efficiency and productivity measures. These are very important characteristics. One of the things that I would do, though, is oops, I'm sorry. One of the things that happens when you've got measures that are easily tracked over time is that you can compare what your projections are versus what actually happened. And I think what that does is incites a very useful conversation about what the the differences are. Why were the projections different than what actually happened? And what can we learn from that conversation? And how can those lessons be applied to future projections? Then when it comes to, and so I think one of the reasons why, again, these measures are aligned to not just other important policy of the state, for example, in stage 2 performance-based distribution, but also with higher ed goals. I think that they could very well be considered for inclusion in state higher education plans. And I want to leave you with a question, and this kind of gets to the politics of determining what higher ed appropriations are. And I think that the appropriations are often left to sort of determined by what's left over from higher priorities such as K-12 and healthcare expenses, etc. And I think that's true to different degrees and across states, and I think that's true within state, to different degrees over time. But I think it's worth asking if the appropriation would be so susceptible to these higher priorities and politics if higher ed could actually defend its projected costs more strategically. That I think is, there is, I think, cause to think that the answer to that question could reasonably be yes. In fact, I saw a presentation by Britt Kerwin from Maryland a couple of years ago in Texas, and one of the things that really struck me that he said is that once the legislature was thoroughly convinced that the University of the Maryland State higher ed was actually looking at efficiency and productivity more seriously and using it to try to increase their productivity and moving forward, they actually got more in appropriations than they expected. And so that may be true for just that year and just Maryland, but I mean, to what extent could that be true elsewhere as well? So that concludes my presentation. I'm going to flip back to the original slide. So in the event that you have any questions, you can please feel free to email me at the email that you see. And if so, I look very forward to hearing from you. And I'd like to close by just thanking you very much for your valuable time. Thank you.